Alright, so today we're diving deep into the cerebellum, one of the most fascinating parts of the hindbrain. It sits within the posterior cranial fossa, just below the occipital lobes and dorsal to the brainstem. The cerebellum plays a vital role in coordinating movements, maintaining balance, and planning complex motor activities. It is made up of three distinct lobes: the anterior, posterior, and flocculonodular lobe. Functionally, the cerebellum is divided into three zones, which are crucial to its operations: the cerebrocerebellum, the spinocerebellum, and the vestibulocerebellum. The cerebellum resides in the posterior cranial fossa above the foramen magnum and is covered by the tentorium cerebelli, a layer of dura mater. It's connected to the brainstem via three paired structures called the cerebellar peduncles: the superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles. These peduncles are pathways for the cerebellar tracts that travel to and from the brainstem. An essential feature is that the two hemispheres of the cerebellum are separated by the cerebellar vermis, right in the midline. The cerebellar tonsils, which are ovoid lobules located on the inferomedial aspect of each cerebellar hemisphere, lie just above the foramen magnum. An important clinical note here: the cerebellar tonsil can herniate through the foramen magnum due to conditions like Chiari malformations or increased intracranial pressure, which can compress the brainstem and lead to cardiopulmonary arrest. The cerebellum is divided into three main lobes: the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe. Two main fissures separate these lobes. The primary fissure divides the anterior and posterior lobes, while the posterolateral fissure separates the posterior lobe from the flocculonodular lobe. There are three pairs of cerebellar peduncles that connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. The superior cerebellar peduncles connect to the midbrain and serve as a major efferent pathway, carrying efferent tracts from the deep nuclei of the cerebellum to the contralateral cortex. The middle cerebellar peduncles connect the cerebellum to the pons and are the largest peduncles, acting as the major afferent pathway. These carry afferent tracts from the contralateral cortex through the pontocerebellar mossy fiber pathway. Lastly, the inferior cerebellar peduncles connect to the medulla and spinal cord, containing both afferent and efferent pathways, carrying ipsilateral proprioceptive information from the spinal cord and efferent Purkinje cell axons. Remember, cerebellar lesions tend to cause neurological deficits on the ipsilateral side of the body due to these tracts crossing over. The cerebellum's blood supply comes from three main arteries: the superior cerebellar artery, from the basilar artery, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, from the basilar artery, and the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, from the vertebral artery. Each of these arteries supplies different parts of the cerebellum and its peduncles. The cerebellar veins drain into the transverse and superior petrosal sinuses, linking up with the venous drainage system. The cerebellum is divided into three functional zones. The cerebrocerebellum involves the lateral hemispheres and receives input from the cerebral cortex. It's responsible for planning and executing complex movements as well as non-motor functions like cognition and learning. It corresponds with the dentate nucleus. The spinocerebellum, comprising the vermis and intermediate zones, receives input from the spinal cord and coordinates body and limb movement. It is associated with the emboliform and globose nuclei. The vestibulocerebellum corresponds to the flocculonodular lobe and receives input from the vestibular nuclei and visual cortex. It controls balance and ocular movements and interacts with the fastigial nucleus. The cerebellar cortex has three layers: the molecular layer, the Purkinje cell layer, and the granular layer. The molecular layer contains basket cells and stellate cells, while the Purkinje cell layer holds the Purkinje cells themselves, which are flat neurons with fan-like dendritic projections. These Purkinje cells are crucial because they're the only output cells from the cerebellar cortex, sending inhibitory signals to the deep cerebellar nuclei. Finally, the granular layer contains granule cells and Golgi cells. An important point here is that while most cells in the cerebellum are inhibitory, granule cells are excitatory, secreting glutamate. The cerebellar medulla consists of climbing fibers, mossy fibers, and the four deep cerebellar nuclei: the dentate, emboliform, globose, and fastigial nuclei. These nuclei form the only efferent pathway from the cerebellum. Afferent tracts bring input from three main sources: the cerebral cortex, spinal cord, and vestibular nerve. They enter the cerebellum mainly through the inferior and middle cerebellar peduncles. Efferent tracts, on the other hand, originate from the deep cerebellar nuclei and primarily travel via the superior cerebellar peduncle. The cerebellum plays a significant role in many clinical conditions. Cerebellar lesions can cause various symptoms, such as ataxia, dysmetria, dysarthria, nystagmus, tremors, and more. There are hereditary ataxias, like Friedreich ataxia, and acquired conditions such as cerebellar stroke and multiple sclerosis. Understanding these symptoms helps in diagnosing cerebellar disorders accurately. So, to wrap up, the cerebellum is a vital structure responsible for coordinating complex movements, maintaining balance, and executing motor plans. It has intricate connections through its functional zones, peduncles, and pathways, all of which ensure seamless communication between the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the cerebral cortex. Understanding the cerebellum's anatomy and functions gives us insights into various clinical conditions, making it an indispensable part of neuroscience. If you enjoyed this comprehensive overview, be sure to check out King of the Curve for more educational content. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell for the latest updates.